Hi, everybody. Thank you for listening to the story, and I hope that you've been enjoying it so far. Today I'm going to read chapters 7, 8, and 9. Remember, you're welcome to pause the video at any point, or you can always go back and listen to parts that you need to listen to again. So, chapter 7, Kelvin. Kelvin had a big, round face. Kelvin, said Mrs. Jewls, I want you to take this note to Miss Zarves for me. Miss Zarves? Asked Kelvin. Yes, Miss Zarves, said Mrs. Jewls. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Kelvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, Kelvin, said Mrs. Jewls. Now take it to her. Kelvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Asked Mrs. Jewls. She's on the 19th story, said Kelvin. Yes, we have already established that fact, said Mrs. Jewls. The 19th story? Kelvin repeated himself. Yes, Kelvin, the 19th story, said Mrs. Jewls. Now take it to her before I lose my patience. But, Mrs. Jewls, said Kelvin. Now, Kelvin, said Mrs. Jewls. Unless you would rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Kelvin. Slowly, he took the note and walked out the door. Ha, 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 laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Miss Zarves, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Kelvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways. But there's something you should know. He also forgot to build the 19th story. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry for his mistake. There was also no Miss Zarves. Miss Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Miss Zarves. And besides that, as if Kelvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jewls had never given Kelvin a note. Boy, this is just great, thought Kelvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't actually have to a teacher who doesn't actually exist, and who teaches on a story that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, then back down to the 18th, and back up to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There never was a 19th story, and there never will be a 19th story. Kelvin walked down to the administration's office. He decided to put the note in Miss Zarves' mailbox. But there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Kelvin too much, however, since he never had a note to begin with. He looked out the window and saw Louis, the art teacher, shooting baskets. Louis will know what to do, he thought, so Kelvin went outside. Hey, Louis, Kelvin called. Hi, Kelvin, said Louis. He tossed him the basketball. Kelvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Louis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Louis asked. I don't have time, said Kelvin. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarves up on the 19th story. Then what are you doing all the way down here? Louis asked. There is no 19th story, said Kelvin. Then where is Miss Zarves? Asked Louis. There is no Miss Zarves, said Kelvin. Well, what are you going to do with the note? Asked Louis. There is no note, said Kelvin. I understand, said Louis. That's good, said Kelvin, because I sure don't. It's very simple, said Louis. You are not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Kelvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Mrs. Jewls that I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Louis. The truth is always best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either. Kelvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jewls' class. Thank you very much, Kelvin, said Mrs. Jewls. Kelvin said, But I... Mrs. Jewls interrupted him. That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you to deliver it. Yes, but you see, said Kelvin. You delivered the note to Mrs. Zarves on the 19th story, asked Jason. How did you do it? What do you mean, how did he do it? Asked Mrs. Jewls. He gave Miss Zarves the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Miss Jewls, said Kelvin. The note was very important, said Miss Jewls. I told Miss Zarves not to meet me for lunch today. Don't worry, said Kelvin. She won't. Good, said Miss Jewls. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Kelvin. But really, it was nothing. All right, Chapter 8, Myron. Myron had big ears. There he is. He was elected class president. The children in Mrs. Jewls' class expected him to be a good president. Other presidents were good speakers, but Myron was even better. He was a good listener, too. But he had a problem. He didn't know what a class president was supposed to do. So he asked, What am I supposed to do? It's a difficult job, said Mrs. Jewls, but you can do it. You must turn the lights on every morning and turn them off at the end of the day. What? Said Myron. As a class president, you must learn to listen, said Mrs. Jewls. I'll repeat myself one more time. You must turn the lights on every morning. I heard you the first time, said Myron. It just doesn't sound like much of a job. It certainly is, said Mrs. Jewls. Without light, I can't teach, and the children can't learn. Only you can give us that light. I think it's a very important job. I guess so, said Myron, but he wasn't convinced. Here, let me show you how to work a light switch, said Mrs. Jewls. I already know how, said Myron. I've been turning lights on and off my whole life. Very good, Mrs. Jewls said. You'll make a fine class president. Myron wanted to be the best president ever. But it was such an easy job, he thought, that anybody could do it. When school let out that day, Myron stayed behind. He turned out the lights by flicking the switch down. Excellent, said Mrs. Jewls. On his way home, Myron heard a horrible noise. First there was loud screeching, then a sharp squeal, a roaring engine, and then a very faint sound of a girl crying. Myron ran to see what had happened. Dana was bent over in the middle of the road. What's the matter? Asked Myron. My dog Pugsy was hit by a car, Dana cried. Who did it? Asked Myron. I don't know, Dana sobbed. They sped away. Well, that's not important, said Myron. We've got to try to save Pugsy. Pugsy was laying unconscious in the street. Myron carefully picked her up. He carried her 2 miles to the vet. Dana cried at his side the whole way. Don't worry, Dana, said Myron. She'll be all right. But he wasn't really sure. He gave Pugsy to the vet, walked Dana home, then walked home himself. Dana was so upset that she forgot to thank him. Myron didn't mind. He thought that was what being a class president was all about. The next morning, before he went to school, Myron went to Dana's house. Pugsy was there. She seemed all right. Dana petted her. Pugsy licked her face. See, Myron, she's all right, said Dana. The vet said that you brought her just in time. Hi, Pugsy, said Myron. He petted her. Pugsy bit his hand. I guess she doesn't know you, said Dana. She was unconscious yesterday when you saved her life. Dana's mother put some medicine and a Band-Aid on Myron's hand. Then she drove the children to school. They were late. They ran up the stairs to Mrs. Jewls' class. The room was completely dark. It's about time you got here, Myron, said Mrs. Jewls. We have no lights. Why didn't somebody else just turn them on? Asked Myron. Because you're the class president, said Mrs. Jewls. Show Stephen how to work the lights. From now on, he will be class president. Myron showed Stephen how to turn on the lights. He flicked the switch up. At the end of the day, Myron showed Stephen how to turn the lights off. He flicked the switch down. After a week, Stephen finally caught on. He made a good president. The lights were on every morning. and off at the end. Myron, who was president for only one day, was the best president in the history of Wayside School. It was just that nobody knew it. Okay, Chapter 9, Mauricia. Mauricia liked ice cream. She was sweet and pretty and could beat up any boy in Mrs. Jewls' class. Everybody liked Mauricia, except Kathy. But then, she didn't like anybody. Mauricia only liked ice cream. Every day, Mauricia brought an ice cream cone to school and kept it in her desk until lunchtime. At first, she brought chocolate ice cream every day. But soon, she got tired of chocolate ice cream, so she started bringing vanilla. But then she got tired of vanilla too. She also got tired of strawberry, fudge ripple, butter pecan, pistachio, and burgundy cherry. And then a terrible thing happened. Mauricia got tired of ice cream. By that time, her desk was a mess. Everything in it was so sticky. Everybody liked Mauricia, but Mauricia didn't like anything. Mrs. Jewls hated to see Mauricia unhappy. "I don't understand it, Mrs. Jewls," cried Mauricia. "There just aren't any good flavors anymore." So Mrs. Jewls worked all night. The next day she brought in a new flavor of ice cream for Mauricia to try. It was Mauricia flavored ice cream. "Everybody will like it," thought Mrs. Jewls, "because everybody likes Mauricia." "Here you are, Mauricia," said Mrs. Jewls. "Mauricia flavored ice cream." My tongue is getting tired of saying Mauricia. Everybody gathered around as Mauricia tasted it. They hoped she'd like it. Mauricia took a lick. "Well," said Mrs. Jewls. Mauricia took another lick. "Well?" asked the class. "This ice cream has no taste," said Mauricia. "It doesn't taste bad, but it doesn't taste good. It doesn't taste like anything at all." Mrs. Jewls was heartbroken. "Here, let me try it," said Todd. He tasted it. "You're crazy, Mauricia," he said. "This is the best tasting ice cream I've ever eaten. Try some, Dee Dee." It's delicious," said Dee Dee. "It's so sweet and creamy." She passed it around the room. "Oh, it is so good," said Leslie. "I think it tastes terrible," said Kathy. "I don't understand it," said Mauricia. "I don't taste a thing." Mrs. Jewls slapped herself on the face. "Oh, I've made a big mistake. Mauricia, of course you can't taste anything. It's Mauricia flavored ice cream. It's the same taste you'll always taste when you're not tasting anything at all." So the next day, Mrs. Jewls brought in Joe flavored ice cream. Mauricia liked that. So did everybody else. Joe thought it had no taste. Everybody liked Mauricia. Mauricia only liked Joe. The following day, Mrs. Jewls brought in Ron flavored ice cream. Ron thought it had no taste, but everybody else loved it. Everybody liked Mauricia. Mauricia only liked Joe and Ron. By the end of the month, Mrs. Jewls had brought in 27 new flavors of ice cream, one for each member of the class. Everybody liked Mauricia, and Mauricia liked everybody. They all tasted so good. All except Kathy. That is, Kathy flavored ice cream tasted a little bit like old bologna. Everybody still agreed that Mauricia flavored ice cream was the best, except Mauricia, of course. She liked Todd ice cream the best. This turned out to be a problem. Every once in a while, Mauricia would try to take a bite out of Todd's arm in order to get that very special flavor. Okay, next time you will hear 10 about Paul, and chapter 11 about Dana, and chapter 12 about Jason. Have a great day. Thanks for listening.